welcome and thank you so much for joining. We are going to talk today about the connection between the Global South debt crisis and climate reparations. What does that mean? A few housekeeping notes. If you can please keep your microphone muted while our speakers are talking, but it is nice if you would like to leave your camera on so that our speakers can see the friendly faces that they're talking to, but only as you're able. Feel free to turn on closed captions if that is helpful to you. You can press the CC button in the bottom right corner, and the magic of AI will try and transcribe our speakers what's being said. We're going to, if you haven't already, please share your name and where you're joining from in the chat, so that we can all get to know each other a bit. And this session is going to start with a talk from Tess Woolfenden, who's a policy advisor at Debt Justice UK, and she's going to be linking debt and climate justice. And then we're going to hear from Mae Buenaventura, who's joining us tonight from the Philippines. Mae is a senior program manager for debt and green economic building at the Asian People's Movement for Debt and Development. And Mae is going to talk to us about global justice for debt and climate reparations and some of the campaigning movement building that they're doing in this global alliance. And then we're going to have some Q&A, breakout groups to discuss the connections between debt and climate justice and how that relates to your work. And then talking about some next steps that we can all take. That's all time providing, of course. But yeah, thank you so much. My name's Sadie, and I'm a loss and damage organizer at Tipping Point UK. And we've been bringing together speakers from across the world who are working on issues related to climate reparations to really understand more deeply how climate reparations relates to a whole host of global justice issues. So all that said, I'm going to pass over to Tess, who is going to present about the links between the debt and climate crises. Over to you, Tess.
Great, thank you so much, Sadie. Bear with me 1 second, everyone, while I just share my slides. Let me put that in presentation mode. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. I'm seeing some nods. Great. Okay. So yeah, hi everyone. I'm Tess from Debt Justice. It's really great to be here today. Thanks so much to everyone for coming and wanting to learn more about this. So yeah, as Sadie said, I'm going to talk a bit about the global South debt crisis and how this links to climate justice and climate reparations. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the debt crisis across the global South, what's happening right now, and then break down how this links to the climate crisis and why we're doing so much work to bridge the gap between these two intersecting issues. So to start with, there is a debt crisis in global South countries. No matter what the IMF and other big powerful actors are saying, there is a debt crisis. By our calculations, there's 54 countries across the global South in debt crisis right now, and many more experiencing unsustainable debt levels. And when we say debt crisis, what we mean is that countries are having to choose between funding the needs of people or servicing their debt, meeting their debt payments. So it means that debt payments are directly undermining what countries are able to spend on healthcare, education, addressing the climate crisis, etc. And actually, many countries are spending more on debt payments than they are on investing on those vital areas of public need. A significant amount of debt payments are to private creditors. So we're talking about the BlackRocks of the world, and they charge really high interest rates on their loans. So when we're talking about money leaving countries through debt payments, we're actually talking about a lot of interest. So we're talking about potential profits for these creditors, often based in the global north. So we're really talking about a debt system that was set up to benefit global north banks, hedge funds, oil traders, etc., while global south countries and communities pay the price. So the debt crisis didn't come out of nowhere. It's very much rooted in colonialism. We refer to it really as a form of neo-colonialism. It's a consequence of how the global economy has been shaped for decades. And whereas before we had colonized colonizer, largely in many ways, this has been replaced by borrower lender. So it's a system, debt is a system, a structure through which rich former colonizers can continue to extract wealth from global south countries, and they can continue to control and exploit global south countries for their own gain. And just to give kind of a couple of examples of what we mean by this. So on the extraction of wealth side, we've calculated that global south governments have paid $2.7 trillion in interest payments alone on their loans since 1970. So that's not even the money that they were lent. That's just like interest on top of the loans, which all represents potential profit for creditors. And to give an example of kind of control and power, often loans that are provided to global south countries, especially by institutions like the IMF and World Bank, they're not given for free. They're given with interest, but they're also given with economic conditions attached. So they use their power as lenders to force countries to implement austerity-based reforms in exchange for the loans that they're given. And as many people probably know, austerity has wreaked havoc across countries all across the world and involves cutting public services, opening up trade, erosion of workers' rights, etc. It's created havoc and real harm. And who pays the price? Well, you kind of already hinted to this, but while rich banks, countries, institutions are profiting from this structure, it's causing immense harm across global south countries and communities. So it can be linked directly to debt, and austerity that's forced through debt can be linked directly to increasing poverty and inequality. Like I've said, cuts in public services, there's the privatization of healthcare, education, skyrocketing cost of living, at the same time as wage cuts, increasing unemployment, worsening working conditions, being very much linked to the erosion of workers' rights and their ability to unionize. And poor, rural and marginalized communities are disproportionately harmed, including gender minorities. And I think this is a really important point, because often what we see with the erosion of public services, etc., is that those services are pushed into the home, and it's often women and other gendered minorities that have to pick up the burden of that labour. And then, of course, debt and the austerity that's enforced through debt also undermines action on the climate crisis. And so I'm going to spend the next part of my presentation explaining what I mean by that. So in the debt justice movement, we talk about a debt climate trap. So on the one hand, we kind of think of it as like a cycle. So at the top of the cycle, we have the debt crisis, and the debt crisis directly undermines countries' ability to respond to the climate crisis. And then on the bottom side of the cycle, we have rich countries' refusal to justly respond to the climate crisis that they have created, which leads to more debt for global south countries. So it creates this debt climate trap that is very difficult for countries to get out of within the current system that exists. So I'm going to break that down a bit further into 4 key points. So starting at the top of this cycle, how the debt crisis undermines climate action. So the first thing really is that when a country has so much debt, they're often repaying huge amounts every year to their creditors, and that very simply takes resources away from national level needs like healthcare, like education, and of course, like the climate crisis. So lower income countries are currently spending 5 times more on debt payments than they are on addressing the impacts of the climate crisis. So I think that number kind of really puts into stark stark reality kind of how much money we're talking about and how much is being drained out of countries through unjust debt. And it again, the injustice really shows, like when a disaster strikes, when a climate disaster strikes, there's nothing in place to allow countries to stop their debt payments. There's a few things happening now, but they're very technical and really rubbish. So when a disaster strikes, countries not only have to find the resources to recover, rebuild, repair, they also have to pay their debt. So there's an example here of the Dominican government had to find several $1 million for a debt payment that fell due literally days after Hurricane Maria caused $2 billion worth of damage on the island. The second point that is also at kind of the top of this cycle on how the debt crisis undermines climate action is linked to natural resource exploitation. So a lot of global south governments don't have the money they need to meet debt payments, not surprisingly because of the high interest rates charged and for many other reasons. But in order to find the resources to meet debt payments, some governments are turning to their natural resources, including fossil fuels. And this is often backed by powerful international actors like the IMF and the World Bank, who in some cases actually say to countries, as a part of conditions on their loans, we want you to expand your fossil fuel infrastructure, your fossil fuel expansion, exploitation, etc. And a really important example to give right now is what's happening in Argentina. So the Argentinian government, backed by the IMF, are expanding fracking in the Vaca Muerta oil and gas fields, explicitly to generate revenue to repay debt. Okay, so now we move to the second part of the cycle. So we've talked about how the debt crisis undermines climate action. And these two last slides are really about how rich countries' refusal to justly respond to the climate crisis is exacerbating debt levels. So we come from a place of there is a climate debt that rich countries owe to the global south, and they absolutely should be paying this climate debt. Global south countries who did not cause the climate crisis should not have to pay for it. But I'm sure, as many of you know here, that's not what's happening at all. So yeah, rich countries promised to provide $100 billion in climate finance per year by 2020. Not only have they not delivered this, even by their own dodgy measurements, 100 billion is a drop in the ocean compared to the finance that global south countries actually need to be able to respond and protect themselves from the climate crisis. And the reason this links to debt is because if rich countries aren't paying up to cover the costs, then global south countries have to cover the costs. And that means taking on more debt. And if I just go back to Dominica's experience of Hurricane Maria, they really didn't get much money to help with recovery and rebuilding from rich countries after that disaster. And so as a result, the country's debt levels shot up. So in 2015, before the hurricane, debt levels were 69% of GDP. And then by 2019, a couple of years after, that was 100% of GDP. And then just to add to this, that loans to global south countries are getting increasingly more expensive because of the climate crisis. So creditors are saying, we think the climate crisis means that you're less likely to be able to repay us, so we're going to charge you more money. So countries are being financially punished for the climate crisis, which they did not create. And then to add insult to injury, the tiny amounts of climate finance that rich countries do provide predominantly come as loans. Over 70% of climate finance is provided as loans. So again, this adds to debt levels, this forced the cost of the climate crisis onto global south countries who did not create it. And that 70% figure is actually worse for a lot of regions. So in Latin America, 90% of climate finance is provided as loans. And again, just to root this in a country's experience. So in Pakistan in 2022, they experienced devastating flooding. It caused like untold harm to many communities across Pakistan who haven't been able to recover. And the government's calculations were that the floods cost $40 billion worth of damage. Rich countries did promise to cover some of those costs, but only pledged 10 billion, which of course is a quarter of what's needed. All of this was pledged as loans. So Pakistan's expected to pick up the bill for the climate crisis and for the flooding that it didn't create. So just to wrap up, the debt and climate crisis are deeply linked. And as I said, we talk about it as this climate debt trap, and we absolutely have to break that cycle if we're going to be able to achieve climate justice, which is why we say that debt justice needs to be a part of climate reparations. I'm going to end there, and Mae is going to brilliantly tell us how we want to break that cycle. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tess, for really drawing that clear connection between the injustice of the debt burden and how that continues to affect people when it comes to the climate emergency. Like the example you used of Pakistan, I visited Pakistan in 2023, which is a year after the flooding, and I still saw that people were deeply personally affected by it. And often, you know, it's not just the governments that are bearing this toll. Like the cost is passed on to the poorest people in the world, who are literally, you know, they're taking out debt as well to rebuild their house, to like buy materials to rebuild their house. So yeah, it's such a deeply interlinked crisis. And thank you. And that stat about people government spending 5 times more on debt servicing than on climate, like, if you think of that scale, is just so resonant. So thank you for that. I'm going to pass on now to Mae, and I'll also share the slides here. Just give me a second to do that.
Thank you, Sadie. Yeah, so I'm Mae Buenaventura from the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. I hope you can hear me well. So I'm just thankful to Tess for laying out a lot of what's happening out there in terms of the debt justice issues. So there's going to be a lot of, similarities, perhaps also stressing on the points earlier shared by Tess. So I'm also going to stress a little bit more on the reparations demand of the Global South. So next slide. So it's already very clear to us that this is really a great injustice, that we are consistently, the Global South countries are consistently in the top 10 countries that are most threatened by the climate crisis. And I think that Justice has also put out a report saying that this happens also to be the countries that are heavily indebted. No? So we need to think of the debt and climate crisis not as separate, but as really very interlinked. And the injustice that we see in how the climate crisis is playing out, that it's penalizing those who least contributed to the harshest impacts, hit by the harshest impacts. We can also think the same way, in a similar way, about the debt crisis, because global North lenders really pushed vigorously loans upon the South, loans of questionable nature and intent, with onerous and burdensome terms, and also neoliberal profit privileging conditionalities, resulting in the kind of economies that we have today that are not resilient, that are very financially dependent, and really the lack of financial autonomy is a big vulnerability to what we call the global rule makers in terms of finance. So we assert that those who have the biggest share of the responsibility for these problems and generated and accumulated wealth in the process are also the ones who should be primarily the ones who are obligated to address these problems. Next slide. So we need to look at debt and climate crisis as rooted in the same system. They're not separate phenomenon. And this is a system that we've seen breeding and worsening injustice and inequality within and across countries. So this is the system that has been promoting or generating the net outflow of resources from the south to the north, and really privileges elites, concentrates wealth in them, and also big corporations. This is also a system that is extractive, no? Really extractive, with excessive and ever increasing use of fossil fuel energy. And even the policy pronouncements of the IFIs that are shifting away from coal, they're substituting that with other forms of fossil fuels, such as fossil gas. This is also a system sustained by sharply unequal relations of power. And I think that's where really the root of the problem is, where the transfer of wealth and resources from south to north is maintained in the various ways, one of which is through the unfair and burdensome practices of lending and borrowing. And of course, it's the kind of system where finance is at the service of profit accumulation and puts southern economies at the mercy of the global market and impoverishes southern peoples in the process. Next slide. So we've been campaigning about what the solution should be, debunking the solutions promoted by the IMF and the World Bank. And as we've seen, since the debt crisis has really been worsening, that these solutions are futile, flawed, and really very narrow in scope, and mostly retweaking of past debt relief mechanisms that also we saw brought countries back into crisis before. So that's happening again. And we're sustaining and advancing the call for solutions to the debt problem, because we need to free up public resources for public goods and services. I think Tess also mentioned that before, that many countries spend way more on debt service than on public spending or on their public expenditures. It's also important because we need to provide space to really be able to chart strategic and structural reforms in the economies of the South. No? How do we chart that path that will stop the constant bleeding out of resources, including the servicing of unsustainable and illegitimate debts, and building strong, equitable, and gender just economies? There's also an imperative for really deep changes, even an overhaul of the IMF and the World Bank and their policies and practices. When more broadly, we need the profound changes in global debt governance and the international financial architecture, which, as we see, is very inequitable and exploitative, and promotes this very unjust economic and financial relations across countries. So next slide. So on reparations, the demand for reparations is a demand for justice that is beyond dispute. No? It's very clear how the climate crisis is a crisis of injustice that's inflicted on the global South, and that's why we also say that also raising the question of who owes whom, because if we look at the debt issue historically, it's really the global North that owes the South a massive debt. And the accumulation of wealth of the global North has really been based on colonial and up to the present history of exploitation and dispossession of peoples in the global South, the plunder and destruction, often irreversible, of our natural resources. And we now have, as a result, financially enslaved economies that are so dependent on debt and accumulating debt all the time. We see sharp inequalities within countries, and also we see many of the vulnerabilities we have now to climate change, pandemics, economic downturns, other forms of crisis, vulnerabilities that have become embedded, strongly embedded and reinforced from that history of or that colonial history of indebtedness to global North lenders. So that's reparations on a broad scale for a host of development issues that we need to address and respond to if we want to see really significant and substantial changes in the way things are today. No? So next slide. And we're talking here about reparations as restorative justice, which means to the extent that's possible to restore what was destroyed. No? So one of that is through the immediate and unconditional cancellation of illegitimate and unsustainable debts still being claimed from the global south. And this would include debts for fossil fuels, no? For fossil fuel lending. And since fossil fuels have been identified as really a main significant factor behind climate change, this should also be canceled outright. And of course, reparations also includes a recognition and acknowledgement of responsibilities and harms inflicted. So we must always stress that for all the 8 decades of the IMF World Bank, correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't seen any acknowledgement or owning up to the harms that they have inflicted on the global south and the world at large. And reparations would also need to be a guarantee of non-recurrence through systemic and structural changes. So that's the reparations on a broad scale. And then next slide. And then there's particular demand for climate reparations, which is part of the reparations for the chaos and destruction that's been inflicted on the global south. So there's a mention, this 5 trillion figure a year estimate in climate finance that we're demanding payment for from wealthy historical emitters for the climate crisis they've caused. So this should cover mitigation, adaptation, just transition, and loss and damage. So that's very specific to the responsibility for the climate crisis and what needs to be done as a matter of justice. And it's also part of the larger demand for reparations. And we know that because of the monumental size of that debt, the northern governments would never be able to fully compensate for the damage done. But still, it should start paying the amount that covers the costs of these requirements, no, for from survival to more long-term preservation of lives and the future of global South peoples. So that is why we also very adamantly in all our actions call out loans that are labeled as climate finance. So we say no to those kinds of climate finance. That is not climate finance. Reparations is not an appeal for charity or aid. It is a matter of justice, no? And so we are also we also emphasize often that climate finance should be public, non-debt creating, and conditionality-free finance channeled through democratic and transparent multilateral financial systems and mechanisms. So I think I've come to just the last slide to share some of the. So now we are on the second day of the Global Days of Action. So this is like a traditional peak of global debt justice movements within the year that we time with the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank to amplify and really put a focus on these leading international financial institutions for their key roles in maintaining a system that is so vicious and discriminatory and extractive, no? And really worsening the multiple crises that exist with us today. No? So there's a demand there for debt, economic, and climate justice. And Tess also mentioned about the Pay Up campaign. We also have an ongoing pay up campaign that really calls for climate finance as a matter of justice, and what the rich countries that are also the highest emitters are supposed to do, no, in line with the demand for climate justice and reparations. I think I've come to the end, and thank you very much, and looking forward to any questions and clarifications. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mae. That's been, yeah, really illuminating. Especially how you have been highlighting the role of the World Bank and the IMF in creating this crisis historically. And when we talk about guarantees of non-repetition for climate reparations, it's really important that we're talking not only about climate change itself, but also about the extractive and exploitative systems that have made the crisis one of unequal vulnerability, where the people who have been most impacted by this unfair system are the ones who are also most impacted by climate change. I think at this point we're going to move to a Q&A. So yeah, I'll invite anyone who has a question. You can raise your hand. You could also raise your hand. You could also write a question in the chat, and then Mae and Tess can decide how they'd like to answer. So we have a first question from, is it Chamadui? Would you like to come in?
Yes, good. It's afternoon here. I'm Chamadui Madegwa. I'm from Kenya, joining in from Kakamega. So the question is, even as we look at the correlation between debt and development, and where we are with the progress that you've seen from the global north, we know the money will not be available yet. So what can we do? I keep looking at what my country can do, Kenya, and even countries of global south can do to sustainably start local resource mobilizing for issues to do with climate change, even as we continue to push for the issue of reparations and financing from global north that comes in form of aid and grants and not loans. So if you have suggestion, I think from the speakers that have already spoken, is there something, are there ways that we need to explore as countries from the global south that will actually get us to sustainably financing for on climate issues, even as we continue to push for the global north to act on the promises that they've made?
All right, starting it off with a difficult one. Mae, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so as Chamadui has said, we should not lose sight of what strategically we're after, and that's really claiming responsibility from those who caused the crisis. But in the meantime, there are several ways also that we should not really look at debt as a kind of a knee-jerk reaction to crisis, which many of our governments do. No, when there's crisis, they say, okay, so let's borrow, like it's built into their minds already that the only solution is to incur debt. So here comes also our to pay in terms of taxes. So there's also a host of fiscal incentives, tax incentives that we just give away, losing potential revenues. So there's several ways that resources can be raised without, first step approach the borrowers, no? And if we're able to, because we're able to do this on different fronts, whether it's in the tax justice movement or debt justice and climate justice, I think that can be very powerful in resisting becoming more indebted under onerous terms. And at the same time, we're continue to fight for what the Global North owes us in terms of the climate debt and reparations. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mae. We have another question, which is about Debt Justice UK, which is Debt Justice has a campaign to reform UK law on commercial debts governed by English law. Are there specific links to climate debt campaigning, and how do we push this forward with the UK government's current economic mindset? This, I think, is one for Tess.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I was going to talk about this in a bit, but I'll just really quickly explain what our campaign is about. So 90% of Global South external debt contracts are governed under English law, which is a colonial overhang, which means that the UK government actually has a significant amount of power to regulate those private creditors. And the reason that they're so important right now is that there are some really weak, not great debt cancellation or debt relief efforts created by the G20, but they're so weak because in order for them to work, private creditors have to participate, and all they do to get them to participate is ask nicely. And you can imagine that's not enough to get them doing what we need them to be doing and doing what's fair and just. So this campaign is about trying to get the UK government to introduce a new law that would compel private creditors to participate in debt relief, and it would force them to the table and stop them blocking what's urgently needed right now in the short term. So how to link this to climate? Yeah, so we see this campaign as linked to climate in the sense that in order to free up funds at a national level and stop the debt crisis blocking climate action, we need to address debt levels, and this is a way to do that. So we see it very much as linked to the debt and climate work already. But we are also working quite closely with different organisations in the UK that do work on climate and working together to lobby the UK government on this. So Debt for Climate in the UK, I think Lorraine is on this call, we're working closely with, and there's also other groups like Can UK. So we are doing a lot of kind of cross-movement advocacy, and there's a kind of general recognition that this is also a climate demand as well as a debt justice demand.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is debt relief is very much part of the Climate Reparations Network's demands as well. There's a question, I think, from Hala, but I don't know if you've lowered your hand. Hala, did you want to come in, or maybe we've lost Hala? Emma says, what would reform to the IMF and the World Bank look like? Is it more about changing the structure of who makes decisions, as in not the global north, or is it about ending private lenders? Mae, maybe do you want to take a shot at that?
Okay, thank you, Emma, for your question. So there's a lot of consensus that these IFIs are doing harm, that they've done so in their long history. We can trace that several decades back, that it is undemocratic. There's also consensus around that. And there's many other things wrong with it, with them. And so I think those questions are all relevant, the ones that Emma posed in looking at the IFIs. But we're actually planning to have discussions globally on what should reform look like, because it can be at a certain level that's shallow, tweaking here and there. It can also be very profound. But this has to come from a really vigorous discussion amongst CSOs and people's organizations and movements of what functions should those institutions serve, or if we change them, what are the terms of changing them? What should they look like? What principles should they operate by? In which case, they will no longer be the IMF and the World Bank that we know now. Yeah. Thanks.
It's restructuring the whole global financial architecture is no small task. There's one more question, and then I think we're going to move on. But Margaret asks, what can a small business do to help? I don't know if Tess, you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was just going to say that one of the privileged things about operating in the debt space is that there is a really wonderful movement for debt justice globally. There are regional networks, but there are also kind of grassroots groups working at a really local level. So I think anyone that wants to get involved in this work, find a group locally. There are organizations all over the place, really happy to share information about that, but definitely check out Debt for Climate as well, because they have fantastic grassroots chapters all the way around the world. And yeah, APMDD operate across loads of different countries, and there's loads of spaces. So I would definitely take a look at what's going on in your local area. But yeah, feel free to reach out and I can point you in the direction of groups that we know of where you're based.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it would also depend what the business does and like what unique offerings everyone has to bring to the table. Great. So we're gonna go into some breakout rooms. Hi, everyone. Welcome back, and sorry to kick you out of your breakout rooms. Looks like you guys were having good conversations in there. Can do a little bit of a feedback from the different groups. And does anyone so there's six groups. Is there anyone from room 1, which is the room with Ken, Lydia, Marlon, and Renata, that wants to share back what you talked about?
Lydia, do you want to give it a go, or should I?
You can roll, Ken, if you like. I can add.
Okay, thank you so much. So it was a brief discussion. We just managed to go through 2 of the questions. We found a very close intersection between debt and climate change. And we used the example of Nigeria, for example. In Nigeria, the government is increasingly extracting crude oil because that country is very heavily indebted. Up to between 80 and 90% of the annual budget goes into servicing loans and debts. Loans and debts taken from the African Development Bank, from the World Bank, from the IMF, and so on and so forth. So when the government has, just about 10% of its annual budget to carry out infrastructural development program, it finds out that it needs to extract more crude oil. Nigeria used to have a capacity to produce about 2.6 million barrels of crude oil daily. The current government says it's pushing to extract 4 million barrels in the next few years daily. And that, of course, is a climate change issue. So debt is driving that issue also. And additionally, because the country is so heavily indebted, no attention whatsoever is paid to climate change. I mean, climate change is down the bottom. Climate change mitigation or adaptation is down the bottom. I mean, the country has more pressing issues, especially with limited resources. But we also see a new kind of dynamics in Nigeria. And that's the fact that increasingly we are seeing the impacts of climate change catching up with all parts of the country. So up north, we're having an encroachment of the desert. Down south, we're having annual floods. Sometimes the floods get as high as 2 meters, and whole communities are buried in floods that last for up to 4 months. We're seeing that increasingly. So something funny is happening as a result of that. We've seen situations where state governments, that's subnational governments, and even the national government resorting to loans to fix infrastructure destroyed by floods and to address desert encroachment. Okay, so loan is increasingly becoming a response to the climate crisis because there's no other system set up to address that. To the next question, which was on how we find the relationship between the climate crisis and what was it again? The climate.
The
Okay.
movement, the climate movement.
Yes, how can those two movements come together? Well, we think that the issues are becoming increasingly closely knit. And we say that it's very important for both movements, the debt reparation movement and the climate movement, to link up at some point. But it's also interesting to note that the fact that there's a growing movement within the climate movement saying that climate finance should not be loans and should not be treated as debt creates actually an opportunity for the climate movement to start having conversations with the larger debt reparation movements around the globe. Yeah, so that's how we went that's how far we went in the discussion. I'm pretty sure Lydia has a thing or two to add.
Yes, quickly, we highlighted that next year is the year of the Jubilee. I think some of you might already know about that. My organization is also actively involved in that. So it would be very interesting. I think what Ken has said, that those that are involved in the Jubilee campaign should work together, collaborate together with the climate movement, because, you know, there's also a COP in Brazil, COP30. So maybe these two could meet each other somewhere next year. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Lydia, do you mind, for those who might not be familiar, just briefly explaining what the Jubilee is?
Well, the Jubilee happens every 25 years. The first one happened in 2000, but actually this is an initiative of the Catholic Church. I think many of you do know that the Pope is already behind this to really address structural injustices, especially in the economy, particularly related to debt. And it's almost like I don't know, I forgot this English word, but it's like a reckoning, forgiveness of debt. So sometimes it involves debt cancellation, and also some can even call it debt restructuring. So next year it will be that important year again. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. I don't know if we're gonna have time to share back from each group, but let's keep going. Group 2, is there someone that's Ben, Christian, Judith, May, Maria, Nithya? Is there someone from your group who'd like to share?
Yeah, Sadie, I'm sorry, we didn't have time to choose to choose a reporter, so anyone can just pitch in. From my notes, we were their countries, we were from Zambia, from Costa Rica, from the UK, India, and of course myself from the Philippines. So it was significant how though distinct countries and also many similarities in terms of how austerity measures are really violating rights to basic services. And then also the way that the pressure to meet debt service is pushing up taxes. So this is not for people's benefit, not for services, but to repay debt. And also consistently, we see how those who are economically disadvantaged, those who need the most support from public subsidies, are also the ones that are most affected because they don't have access anymore to services that government is supposed to provide. Many of these have been privatized. No? And so some of the actions that we talked about, there's several, for example, Judith from Can, Zambia, and Maria are going to COP in Baku. So I also shared about a debt justice day that will be organized in Baku, which they can, of course, open to everyone to join. And also, Nithya is pretty much very interested in the issue, and so very welcome, just especially young people who become interested in the issue. Very inspiring. So yeah, that's basically what our talk revolved around. And then Ben suggested really a die-in somewhere in London. Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, to block the a blockade before in front or in the vicinity of the entrance of Black Rock. offices, or yeah. So I said I'd really love to see that happen in London. So that's all from our end, Sadie.
Thanks so much. Yeah, yeah, sounds like a die-in in London would be a good tactic. Okay, then group 3, we've got Dornweiler, Dornwile, Emma, Stephen, Tess. Does someone want to share back from group 3?
Yeah. So we were talking about in quite I guess, a personal way that we would get involved in this. So we all had different backgrounds. So I am doing a master's and I'm interested in researching this topic further. So contributing to or looking at the research that already exists and kind of trying to find a balance. But Tess was also saying trying to find different ways to make policies around global justice or debt justice more accessible and more interesting for the everyday person. So trying to broaden the audience and do a bit more with that. And then Stephen mentioned he's hosting a vigil with his local MP and bishop, and again, trying to broaden what they're already doing to include more people. So I think a key element that we were talking about was how can we expand the audiences that we engage with and kind of add more depth to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Emma. Yeah, there's definitely that question about public engagement. Like, how do we move this conversation beyond maybe folks who are already deeply embedded in the work to reach new audiences? Someone from room 4, Cecilia, Lorraine, Stefan.
Hi, yeah, we really just myself and Winnie talked about the work that we do. Really, it was just kind of more of a chit chat. We did go through those questions. We came about with the fact that the debt and climate movement, like Debt for Climate, look at the fact that debt kind of joins so many different cross sections, including climate justice, social justice, faith groups, unions. So this is something on where we can all sit together and collaborate. As we always say, there is no climate justice without debt justice. And then we looked at like ideas. I think Lydia's just spoken when he spoke about some of the work that they were doing with Jubilee. I've got her email address. It was a great networking session. And so, yeah, because that is something that I definitely second that, and with Tess too here in the room, we need to really focus on collaborating with Jubilee. So I think those are concrete actions. Ben, you talked about dying in BlackRock with another campaign that I'm involved in. We were thinking about targeting BlackRock next year at their AGM. So yeah, you've seen my name, reach out and let's see, because there's a lot of stuff. I mean, BlackRock, so many things that you could do, isn't there? So yeah, those were actions. I'm going to do a shameless plug of Debt for Climate and post as info in the chat. Yeah, so yeah, check. That's me and our group. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Please do share. I've been following the work you're doing and it's amazing. And would love to also get in touch, Lorraine. But that's aside. That's a thing for after this. Someone from room 5 want to share. That's Cordelia, Margaret, and Ricardo.
Yes, is that okay if I leap
Yes.
in there? The first thing I wanted to say is I don't know whether Ricardo would like the opportunity to speak. We had a little difficulty because neither Margaret or I speak Spanish. So Ricardo, I don't feel you had an opportunity to have your voice heard. So I don't know if there's anybody in the group who could facilitate, or if there's anything Ricardo would like to say, because your voice hasn't really been heard yet, Ricardo. Is that possible in any way?
Yeah, I think I understand Spanish. I think we have a few Spanish speakers here. So yeah, Ricardo, if you'd like to
Only if you want to.
you can speak in Spanish. Si quieres compartir algo, puedes hablar en español y vemos si podemos traducir.
Gracias. Trataré de hablar despacio para que puedan entender. Ha sido muy importante todo lo dicho y explicado en todas las intervenciones. Y eso, en el caso mío, yo soy de Ecuador, Sudamérica, me genera un compromiso de trabajar para difundir mucho más toda la actividad que ustedes realizan y sobre todo con tratar de unificar, porque hay mucha dispersión de movimientos y personas que luchamos contra el cambio climático y por el no pago de la deuda externa. Tenemos actualmente un gobierno neoliberal y acá vivimos, para no repetir, ¿no? Para no repetir todo lo que ustedes han dicho, vivimos las mismas cosas. Se privilegia el pago de la deuda mientras que los servicios públicos son un desastre, ¿no? Entonces es hora de que construyamos y unifiquemos más que nada todo un movimiento que existe disperso para que sea más efectiva la lucha contra el pago de la deuda y por el cambio climático. Por ejemplo, pensamos asistir a la COP16 que va a haber en Cali, Colombia, en los próximos días, ¿no verdad? Donde se va a tratar también este tema, por supuesto. Bueno, yo les agradezco por toda la información, por toda la motivación que nos han generado y ese es mi compromiso. Gracias.
Gracias, Ricardo. I would welcome someone who is a fluent Spanish speaker to correct me, but I think the overall gist of what Ricardo said is he's from Ecuador, and there he sees many movements that are fighting for debt and climate justice, but there's a neoliberal government, and with neoliberal government makes it more difficult. To not repeat what's happened in terms of entrenching people in cycles of debt, and it's time to unify our movements. And he's hoping to participate in the biodiversity COP that's happening in Colombia this month. Yeah, if there's something else that I missed, I think that's the overall. Just thank you for sharing, Ricardo.
Would it be okay just to add something else from group 5? So Margaret and I are not very experienced in this area, but I'm involved in some campaigns and actions that are happening about the Ensure Our Survival Week of Action. And I know Extinction Rebellion are going to focus on flooding as the theme. And when I heard was reminded about the flooding in Pakistan in 2022, and you know, that's shocking that they're having to pay for that. I thought I am going to kind of try and draw a connection there. And also when the COPs are going on, I really wanted to do something in Manchester that focuses on loss and damages and pay reparations. People in the group were saying, oh, you know, it's got to be something that local people in Manchester will be able to relate to. And I think really, you know, okay, you know, people in the UK we've got things that are affecting us, but I do think people care. I think we can still, you know, get people to care about what's happening, you know, in the global south. So that was our group.
Absolutely. People totally care. They see what's going on in the world and they understand that climate change is affecting people. And I think also this is one thing that just particularly bothers me when people talk about what people here care about. I think that's assuming that, you know, I feel like that's erasing the huge diasporic communities as well that like are so
agree
to people all around the world.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you for that. And I think the last group is room 6, Alvek or Alvis Shamadui. and Adriana, if one of you wants to share back.
Hello. If I'd be happy to share, if that's okay, Chamadwi. We also, just like in many groups, we weren't able to decide who will report back. So we didn't go through point by point. I mean, chronologically, it's more of a freewheeling conversation that we have, because for the most of the time, it was Chamadwi and I were in the working group, in the breakout. So just a few points or highlights that we discussed. So Chumad is a journalist from Kenya, while I am from the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, a colleague of Mae. So, well, obviously in my work, it is very relevant as discussed earlier. And Shamadwi finds that it's really very interesting as a journalist to look into and be cover and raise awareness on the connections of the debt and climate issues, especially considering that there's observation that there's still a lot of people who don't see the connections on these crises. We also talk about some observations that to some there are the issue of either climate or debt or financing in general is too technical. It's to an elitist issue, and it's important, we thought, it's really, especially in the line of media, journalism, communications work, to really demonstrate that these issues are not just connected, but also both are equally relevant to communities, to the daily lives of communities. And it's an important issue that we have to engage in. We discuss about really the need to further strengthen collaboration between debt and climate movements, especially holding webinars such as this, jointly discussing the issues in the, not just jointly discussing, but underscoring the interrelation of these issues, especially on the questions or discussions around financing, who should be paying, who should be financing, who should be paid for climate action, and what is all the money, the money talk, because that's a big intersection between the issues of debt and the climate. And we also talked about, well, I won't share about the Global Days of Action, it was mentioned earlier, but we hope that there are more in the future, more joint work on education work, on and also communications work, especially as I mentioned, we mentioned the demonstrating both the connection and also the relevance of these two issues, that when we go to the ground, both impact on communities and the daily lives of people. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. So I think this kind of brings us to the end of the discussion. I just wanted to give the opportunity to Tess and Mae to share any ways that people can get involved. I'm really very happy to see people are exchanging contacts in the chat. We love to see it. But yeah, I don't know, Tess, it looks like you have some links to share to different things that people can sign up to. Yeah. And then Mae can talk from a more global perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, so a couple of things to share. First things first is tonight we are hosting a rally with Debt for Climate, which I think is going to be really exciting. It's going to have quite a few speakers from Global South countries speaking about their experience of unjust debt, but actually more about their experience of resisting unjust debt. There's going to be poetry and music, and we hope it's going to be a kind of creative, interesting way of talking about these issues. So there's still space. Please do sign up and join us for that tonight. I've just posted the link in the chat. For anyone that's in the UK, please do check out our website and join our mailing list. As a few people have said, it's Jubilee year next year, so we're expecting that to be a really big year for debt justice. We often have actions, we have petitions, there's things you can do to support this work right now, including if any groups are interested in hosting sessions like this with their own spaces. We really enjoy kind of doing things a bit differently, hosting spaces like this, knowledge share, discussions, etc. So please do reach out if you're interested in having spaces like this as well. But yeah, over to Mae for international things you can get involved in as well.
Yeah, thank you, Tess. And I'd like to invite you to sign up the Global Days of Action statement. The link is in the PowerPoint, which at the end, which I hope also can be shared with the participants. And on the 17th, that's tomorrow, right? Gender equality has really been co-opted by these IFIs, and they've even come out with the gender strategies that, of course, talks about a lot of market-based approaches that instrumentalizes women. So I hope you can join the webinar, and I'll put the registration link in the chat later. And then also on the 26th, this is happening in the Philippines. It is the launch of the International People's Tribunal in Manila, in the Philippines, and there's going to be a first session to be held. Succeeding sessions will be held in Nepal, India, and Africa, and final decision will be passed in time for the spring meetings in 2025. So the event will be live streamed on the APMDD Facebook account. So if the time zone is challenging, because it's going to be 1:30 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon in the Philippines, you can still go back to the Facebook page and watch it on another time. So I invite you to join us, watch the tribunal, and also invite you, it's open to receive whatever cases that you want to showcase or testify about. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mae and Tess, for joining us to speak today. And thank you to everyone who has joined this session. I really appreciated all of your inputs, and I was really excited to see everyone cross-pollinating ideas and sharing contact. So if you want to drop your contact in the chat, you can also do this. We'll send out the recording of this session afterwards. And one more plug for if you didn't have enough events to sign up to, we've also got a mailing list for the Climate Reparations Network. If you not already on it, many of you are already on it. I will end the session here because we're at time. But Henry, if you want to stick around and ask a question after, you're welcome to do so. Thank you so much, everyone. Hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
everyone.